Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture number 9 and the first lecture on labor demand. During our earlier discussions, we analyzed that the factors that determine how many hours the workers they choose and they are willing to rent to the employer in the labor market, and how many workers choose to enter to the labor market. So, we had already discussed that how many workers they enter into the labor market and how many hours of work they decide to rent to the employer. So, the labor market outcomes, however, depend not only on the willingness of the workers to supply their time to work activities, but also on the willingness of the firms to hire those workers. Therefore, we now turn to the discussion on the labor demand. We will discuss the demand side of the labor market. So, the hiring and firing decisions made by the firms create and destroy many jobs at a particular point of time. When we look at the firm's perspective, the firms do not hire workers simply because the employer want to see persons or individuals filling the various positions in the firm. Rather, the firm hires workers because consumer want to purchase a variety of goods and services in the product market. So, in effect, the firms are the middlemen that hire workers to produce those goods and services. So, the firm's demand is just like firm's demand for other inputs in the production process like land, building, machines. So, the demand for labor by the firm is not a direct demand, it is a derived demand. It is derived from the demand for goods and services for the consumers in the product market. The goods and services which the consumers they consume in the product market, they demand those goods and services. Those goods and services has to be produced by the firm. Therefore, the firm need the labor to be hired. So, the firm's labor demand is a derived demand. Despite the similarity between the factors that determines firm's demand for labor and the firm's demand for other inputs in the process of production, the economists devote a great deal of time to separate study of this labor demand. After all, workers too differ from other inputs in a number of important ways we had already discussed in our overview of the market lecture. So, how labor is having certain unique features, that is why it requires a separate branch of study. Further, if you look at, all of us are keenly interested in the characteristics of the firm that rent our services for 8 hours a day. Some firms provide working conditions and social opportunities that are quite amenable, whereas working conditions in other firms may be appealing. Further, the determinants of the demand for labor also have important consequences on the front of social and political perspective. It has social and political implications. In fact, many of the central questions in the economic policies involve the number of workers that firm employ and the ways that they offer to those workers. such diverse policies like minimum wage, employment subsidies, the restrictions on an employer's ability to fire or lay off workers, are the attempts to regulate various aspects of the farm's labor demand. However, to understand labor demand, we will start with farm's production function. So, the production function describes the technology that the farm used to produce certain goods and services. So, how much output is produced by any combination of inputs is the production function for a particular farm. Production is nothing but transformation of inputs to outputs. If we can define a production function that output is a function of inputs, so here we have taken a production function where we have restricted the inputs into two inputs. One is labor, another one is capital, Q is the output. So, we have defined the production function here. Output is a function of labor and capital. In terms of labor, we have defined that the number of employee hours hired by the farm is the E, is the employment or the labor, and the capital K, we have defined it as the aggregate stock of lands, machines, other physical inputs, and Q is the output of the farm. So, here we have defined output is a function of these two inputs, one is labor, another one is capital. The definition of labor input here makes two assumptions that are very restrictive. First, the number of employee hours E is given by the product of number of hours the worker hired multiplied by the average number of hours worked per person. So, here what we have done is that we have restricted how we are measuring this employment is that it is the product of number of workers hired multiplied by the average number of hours worked per person. We are assuming that the farm gets same amount of output when it hires 10 workers for 8 hours a day as when they hire 20 workers for 4 hours shift. Further, here we are ignoring the distinction between number of workers hired and the number of hours worked throughout much of our this labor demand lecture. We will simply refer to the labor input E as the number of workers hired by the farm. Second, the production function assumes that different types of workers can somehow be aggregated into a single input that is called labor. So, we are assuming that labor is homogeneous. In fact, workers are very heterogeneous. Some workers are college graduates while others are high school dropouts. Some have a lot of labor market experience, whereas many are the new entrants. So, in short, some workers probably make much larger contribution to the farm's output than other workers. But here we are assuming that all the workers are same. We are taking into consideration in one bracket that the labor is homogeneous, all the workers are same. So, let us first derive the farm's labor demand by ignoring these complications. So, the simpler model will provide a solid understanding of how farms make their hiring decisions. Now, we define the production function. Output is a function of both labor and capital. While talking about production function, it is important to discuss about the concepts like marginal product and average product. When we are saying marginal product of labor, the marginal product of labor is defined as the change in the output resulting from hiring an additional worker holding constant the quantities of all other inputs. So, in this case we are trying to find out the marginal product of labor keeping the quantity of capital constant. What is the change in the output due to change in labor? Similarly, the marginal product of capital MPK is defined as the change in the output due to 1 unit change in the capital stock holding constant the quantity of other inputs like labor. And average product is nothing but the per worker contribution or per capital unit contribution to the output. Here we assume that marginal product of both labor and capital are positive in number, so that hiring either more workers or more capital lead to more output. Now, let us try to understand little bit more deeper into these concepts of marginal product and average product. Now, holding the capital constant, if the price of the output is $2 and holding the capital constant, we can only, if output Q is a function of employment and labor and capital. So, keeping capital constant, any change in the output can come from change in labor. So, here we have taken one example, numerical example, how to estimate this marginal product and average product of labor and the value of marginal product of labor and value of average product of labor. When 1 unit of labor is employed to a fixed capital, total output produced is 11. So, the marginal contribution of this particular first worker is 11 units and the average product is 11. Average product is nothing but the total output divided by the number of workers. This gives you per worker output distribution. When second labor is employed, the total output increased from 11 to 22. The marginal contribution of this second labor is 16. When we employ the third labor, the total output increases from 27 to 47. The contribution of this third labor is 20. So on so forth, as you keep on increasing the number of worker, the total output increases. If you look at the marginal product, how it is behaving, you can see that marginal product increases, reaches a maximum point, then starts declining. The per unit contribution of the labor. When we look at the average product of labor, it is simply output, total output divided by the number of workers. It keep on increasing, reaches a maximum point, then starts declining. When it comes to the value of marginal product of labor, value of marginal product of labor is nothing but the marginal product multiplied by the price. So, it follows the same pattern. It increases, reaches a maximum point, then starts declining. So, as the average product of labor, it increases, reaches a maximum point, then starts declining. So, marginal product increases, reaches a maximum point, then declining. Average product increases, reaches a maximum point, then declining, whereas the total product increases, keep on increasing as you keep on increasing the number of employment. If we can plot this, we can see the behavior of this total product, marginal product and average product of labor. Simply in this graph we have plotted the total output increases as you increase. On this x axis we have taken the number of workers, on the y axis we have taken the output. As you keep on increasing more and more labor, the total output increases. On this left side you can see we have plotted the marginal products and average products. Marginal product increases, reaches a maximum point, then starts declining. Average product increases, reaches a maximum point, then starts declining. the marginal product curve is nothing but it is the slope of the total product curve. If you look at the total product, it increases at an increasing rate up to a certain point. After that, it increases at a decreasing rate. So, the marginal product curve follows the same. It increases when the total product curve increases at an increasing rate, the marginal product curve is increasing. When the total product curve is increasing at a decreasing rate, the marginal product curve is declining. And the marginal product curve intersects this average product curve from above at its maximum point. In the earlier part, the marginal product curve lies above the average product curve when the average product is increasing. So, the marginal product curve lies above the average product curve. The average product curve lies above when the marginal product curve is declining. And the marginal product curve intersects the average product curve at its maximum point when this average product is maximum. Now, the assumptions that the marginal product of labor eventually declines follows from this law of diminishing returns. Further, this assumption of diminishing return also implies that the average product curve will eventually decline. Now, to analyze the hiring decisions made by the firm, we make an assumption about the firm's behavior. The firm's objective is to maximize profit. So, profit maximization is the firm's behavior. Now, how we measure profit? Profit is nothing but its total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue, it is profit is nothing but revenue minus cost. So, revenue comes from the output multiplied by price per unit price. The amount of output produced by the firm multiplied by the per unit price of that output is the total revenue. So, if you look at this profit equation here, P into Q is the total revenue minus cost leads towards the hiring of labor minus the cost getting the capital. So, here WE is nothing but E is the total number of workers employed multiplied by the wage per unit workers wage. RK is the capital K is the amount of capital employed multiplied by the interest. So, the profit is nothing but this total revenue minus this total cost. Here we are assuming that the firm is operating in a competitive environment. So, a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker. So, firm is very small in the industry to influence the price. So, the price is at which the firm can sell the output, here we have taken P, is given by the industry. Also, the wage and the interest, the price for the capital are also given by the industry because the firm is operating at a competitive environment. So, all these components, the price components, price of the output, price of the labor, price of the capital, the firm is unable to influence that. Simply the competitive firm is a price taker. Because a perfect competitive firm cannot influence the price. So, a firm maximizes profit only by hiring right amount of labor and capital. It does not have any capacity to influence the price of the output, price of the factor inputs. So, what is the employment decision of the firm in the short run? Here we have defined the production function as a short run production function. Short run is a phenomena where at least one input is fixed. So, we have kept the capital as the fixed K star. So, only you can change the output by changing the amount of labor. In the short run, the farm can then determine the additional output produced by each worker by reading the numbers of this marginal product curve, that how the individual worker is contributing, adding up to the total product. For example, if you go to the table, the 8th worker hired increases the farm's output by 11 units. So, to get the dollar value of what this each additional worker produces, we can multiply the marginal product of labor multiplied by the price of the output. So, this is called the value of marginal product. So, we have estimated in that table the value of marginal product of labor. So, if the 8th worker is contributing 11 units and the price of the output is 2, then the value of the marginal product of 8th worker is $22. So, simply we can get the value of marginal product of labor multiplying the marginal product of labor with the per unit price. We can also estimate the value of average product of labor multiplying average product of labor by the per unit price. These two concepts are important to take a decision on the employment, how many workers to be employed in short run. The value of marginal product of labor is the dollar increase in the revenue generated by an additional worker holding the capital constant. So, as I said, the price of the output is 2, the value of marginal product of worker 8th worker is $22. Because the value of marginal product equals the marginal product of labor multiplied by the price of the output, the value of marginal product curve simply it is the blown up version of this marginal product curve. And the law of diminishing return then implies that the dollar gains from hiring additional worker eventually declines. So, if we can draw the value of marginal product of labor and the value of marginal product of average product of labor curve, then it will simply follow the marginal product and average product. So, here you can see this is the value of marginal product of labor. It is simply multiplied by the marginal product of labor and price, and the value of marginal product of labor curve is simply multiplied by the average product of labor and the price. Now, the employment decision in the short run, how the farm takes a decision that how many workers should be hired. So, the condition that how many workers the farm should hire is that the value of marginal product of labor must be equal to the wage rate. Wage is nothing but the per unit cost of labor. So, value of marginal product of labor is nothing but per unit revenue of the labor, whereas W is nothing but wage is nothing but the per unit cost of labor, and this value of marginal product of labor curve is it must be declining. These two conditions should be satisfied. So, this is the first order condition, this is the second order condition. Now, if the wage rate is 22 and we are having this value of marginal product curve and the value of average product curve like this, and the wage rate is 22. On the x axis we have taken the number of workers, on the y axis we have taken the wage in dollar. Now, if you go by the conditions that how many workers the farm should hire, the profit maximizing condition of the farm is where the value of marginal product of labor equals to the wage. then it fulfills the condition that the work and the value of marginal product curve is declining. So, it fulfills at the point that the farm should hire 8 workers in order to maximize profit with this given 22 wage. Now, what is going to happen if the farm is going to hire 6 workers? Now, if the farm is going to hire 6 workers, the farm is going to pay the 6th worker this $22, but the farm is getting the revenue from the worker, the value of marginal product of labor is here. If the farm employs 7th unit, 7th worker, the farm is paying this much of wage to the worker, but still he is getting value of marginal product of 7th worker is here. So, moving from 6th to 7th worker is still going to add to the total revenue. So, as the profit is going to increase. So, as long as the revenue is going to increase, the profit of the farm is going to increase, moving from 6th to 7th and 7th to 8th worker. Now, when it comes to 8th worker, the farm is paying this much of wage and the farm is getting this much of revenue from the 8th worker. If the farm wants to go beyond this 8th worker, the farm wants to hire 9th worker. At this point, at this 9th worker, you can see the farm is paying this much of wage to the 9th worker, but this 9th worker is giving the revenue, the value of marginal product of labor is this much. So, it is optimum for the farm that to hire 8th worker, where how much he is paying in terms of wage, he is getting exactly that much in terms of value of marginal product of labor. So, if you compare this 8th worker and the first worker, you can see this first order condition fulfilled, that value of marginal product of labor equals to the wage rate, the first worker. Why then the farm is not hiring only one worker? If you look at it, when the farm keep on increasing, hiring the worker from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, you can see the marginal product of labor is increasing at a much faster rate. The total product is increasing at an increasing rate. So, which is saying that this total revenue is increasing. So, as the farm keep on increasing or moving from first to second, second to third, third to fourth worker. So, therefore, the sufficient condition, that profit maximizing condition should be the value of marginal product of labor must be declining. At this point, the value of marginal product of labor is increasing, which means per unit contribution next to next, next to next is increasing. So, the farm will optimize or maximize its profit by hiring 8 units of worker, where the value of marginal product of labor equals to the wage rate and the value of marginal product labor is declining. Here the question is, why the law of diminishing return plays such an important role in the theory? Now, if you look at this graph, if the value of marginal product keep rising, then the farm would maximize profit by expanding indefinitely. The output will be infinite. It would be then be difficult to maintain the assumption that the farm's decision do not affect the price of the output or the price of the labor and capital. So, in effect, the law of diminishing return sets the limit on the size of the farm. It is also important to emphasize that the profit maximizing condition requiring that the wage equals to the value of marginal product of labor does not say that the farm should set the wage equals to the value of marginal product of labor. After all, the competitive farm has no influence over the wage. and therefore, the farm cannot set the wage equals to anything. All that the farm can do is set its employment label, so that the value of marginal product of labor equals to the predetermined wage rate. So, the farm has to only set that how much of labor should be employed in order to maximize profit. Further, it is worth considering that the farm's hiring decision, if the competitive wage were very high. So, let us say the wage rate is 38 in the figure. At this wage, it would seem that the farm would hire 4 workers, where the wage equals to the value of the marginal product. If the farm hire 4 workers at the wage rate 38, the value of average product of labor is 32, which would be less than the wage rate. So, because the per worker contribution to the farm is less than the wage, the farm makes loss and he has to leave the market. The only point on the value of marginal product of labor are relevant for the farm's hiring decision are those points that lies on the downward sloping portion of this curve below the point where this value of marginal product of labor curve intersects the value of average product curve. So, here you can see that as we discussed, if the wage rate is going to 38, the farm should hire 4 units of worker considering this equilibrium condition, profit maximizing condition. So, at this point the value of marginal product of labor equals to the wage rate and the value of marginal product labor is declining. But if you are considering that the farm is going to hire 4 workers, if you look at the average product of labor at this point, the average product of labor may be 32, somewhat less than the wage rate. So, in this case the farm is making loss. So, it is only that portion of the value of marginal product of labor the farm should consider where the farm should operate or hire the amount of labor, is that this part of the value of marginal product of labor. This part of the value of marginal product of labor is below the average product of labor. So, this is this part, within this part the farm should restrict. So, for our convenience we will take into consideration that this only this part of this value of marginal product of labor for our further analysis. We can now derive the short run demand curve for the labor. This demand curve tells us that what happens to the farm's employment as the wage changes, holding the capital constant. So, while constructing this short run labor demand curve, we only consider the relevant downward sloping portion of the farm's value of marginal product of labor, as I have highlighted. So, we have taken into consideration this value of marginal product of labor of that part where this value of marginal product of labor is declining and it lies below the value of average product of labor. So, this is the short run demand function for the labor of the farm. Now, you can see if the wage rate is 22 is this given wage rate, and with this value of marginal product of labor, the farm is going to hire 8 workers. Now, if the wage rate declines from 22 to 18, the farm would hire 9 workers. So, any drop in the wage rate further to 16, the farm will keep on hiring, increase the hiring. So, as there is a decline in the wage rate, the farm is going to hire more and more labor. So, if you see the relationship here, that the wage rate and the number of employment, it is having an inverse relationship. It happens because the marginal product eventually declines and the short run demand curve for the labor is downward sloping. So, the short run demand curve of the labor is given by the value of marginal product of labor. Further, the position of the labor demand curve depends on the price of the product market, because the value of marginal product is given by the product of the output price and the marginal product. So, the short run demand curve shifts up if the output becomes more expensive or the price of the output increases. For example, suppose the output price increases, shifting this value of marginal product curve in the graph. Now, if the price increases, the value of marginal product of curve is going to shift from this to this, because the value of marginal product curve is nothing but price multiplied by value of marginal product of labor. So, if price increase, simply there will be a shift in the value of marginal product of labor. Keeping the wage rate constant, if there is an increase in the price, which will shift the value of marginal product of labor, in this case there will be an increase in the employment. So, an increase in the price of the output which shifts the value of marginal product curve upward increases the employment. There are other factors also which can influence the shift of this value of marginal product of labor, like productivity, efficiency of the worker. So, any change happens to the wage rate, you are moving along with this demand function, along with this value of marginal product of labor. Any change happens to the price of the output, efficiency of the worker, productivity of the worker, then there will be a shift in the value of marginal product of labor and we are going to have more labor. So, we have derived the short run labor demand curve for a single farm. So, we obviously can apply the same approach and derive the short run labor demand for every farm in the industry and the group of farms that produces the same output. So, it would seem that the industry's labor demand curve can be obtained by getting up additionally horizontally if we add the demand curves of the individual farms. Let me give you one example. Suppose that every farm in the industry hires 15 workers when the wage is 20, but increases in the employment to 30 workers when the wage falls to 10. So, at industry level, you can see that what will be the industry demand curve. It is simply just by adding or summing up the employment across the farm. So, if there are 2 farms in the industry, one might conclude that this industry hires 30 workers when the wage was 20 and will hire 60 workers when the wage will fall to 10. So, here you can see what I have said is that when the wage, if there are 2 farms in the industry, each farm is going to hire 15 workers when the wage is 20. So, you can see the industry employment when the wage is 20, the industry employs 30 workers. There are 2 farms. Now, when the wage has declined, simply each farm is going to hire 30 workers and the industry will hire, the total number of workers is 60. So, if we are doing so like this, simply we are adding this horizontally or summing up the farms employment to get the industry labor demand. This approach is however incorrect, because it ignores the fact that the labor demand curve for a farm takes the price of the output as given. So, when we are talking about the labor demand curve of a farm, we are considering that the price of the output is fixed, is given. is constant. So, each farm in a perfect competitive industry is small enough that cannot influence the prices. But if all the farms in the industry take advantage of the lower wage rate by increasing their employment, then there would be a great deal of more output produced in the industry, and this would imply that the price of the output will fall. So, as a result, if all the farms expand their employment, then the value of marginal product of labor will decline. So, the labor demand curve of each individual farm shifts slightly to the left, and the employment in the industry would be then expand less than would have been in case if we just added up the demand curve of the individual farms. So, you can see, so when it comes to simply adding, now because of the decline in the wage rate, each farm is going to produce more. So, as the output in the industry is large, and this will lead to a decline in the marginal product of labor. So, which will push back this labor demand curve of each individual farm. So, it will move to this place, and with 10 wages now each farm is going to hire 28 workers. So, at industry level, if you add up this, then the earlier it was DD was the demand curve for the industry. Now, because of the decline in the marginal product of labor, now it has shifted or little bit tilted to TT. So, with this wage rate 10, now the industry's employment is 56. So, the industry demand curve is not given by the horizontal sum up of the farm's demand curve, but it takes into account the impact of the industry's expansion on the output price, which is the true demand function is the TT of is the industry labor demand function. So, the true industry labor demand function is given by this TT, and this curve which accounts for the fact that price of output adjusts if all farms expands. So, it is steeper than the industry demand curve one would obtain just summing up horizontally. So, the demand curve of the individual farms. So, this is about how we derive the short run labor demand function for an farm and for the industry as a whole. In the next lecture, we will discuss about the long run labor demand of the farm. Thank you.